Okay. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
As I'm sure all of you know, the reason why we canceled the last Zoom session was because of the raging fires in Orange County, particularly in Irvine, of course. So we really had to evacuate. And as a result, this caused a lot of logistic problems and challenges and it was impossible at that point to hold any Zoom sessions or to think about lecturing in that particular moment. And, for that reason, I was not able to do that. It was a miracle, in fact, to actually look at the intensity of the fire. I don't know if I'm sure most of you were able to do that, see it on video probably, or if you lived next to areas that were pretty much affected by the fires, you would know exactly the intensity and the extent of the fire that we experienced. So it wasn't really uh, a small fire; it was huge fire. And as I said, it's a miracle that the fire fighters were able to contain it in a very short time period. I don't know how they did it. It's just a miracle, I guess. Maybe luck had to play with that as well in terms of light winds that actually they were predicting to see very high Santa Ana winds, but for some reason it simmered down, and as a result, I think firefighters were able to contain the fire, even though in the first day there was zero containment. But I think in the second day they were able to do a much better job. And I guess, we owe a lot to those firefighters who actually put their lives on the line day in and day out just to protect us and protect our property. And I believe probably a couple of them were injured during the course of action. I think their injury was pretty bad. I believe it was first degree burns, but I wish them all the best. And as I said, we can't thank them enough for the work that they do. So that's basically the reason why we had to postpone or cancel the Zoom session on that particular day. Uh, thank God we are all safe now and everything is back to normal. And I hope that everyone is safe as well, so that we can go back to normalcy. Um, okay, having said that, are there any questions before we start? Anyone has any questions? Okay, today what we want to do is we want to look at chapter 9, I guess 7, I'm sorry, which is entitled The Rise and Fall of the State-Led Development. Now, in this chapter, what we want to do basically is we want to look at the growth of the states in the MENA region. How large were these states, especially um, prior to 1985? Because after 1985, a lot of these states shrank in size as a result of the structural reforms that they were forced to undertake by the financial global institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. So obviously uh, the size pretty much shrank. But before that, I mean, the states in the MENA region were very huge. And still, I mean, even today, after the structural reforms, they still maintain that power and they still maintain the influence on all aspects of life, whether it is economic, social, political. So the state is still supreme. And this is basically what we want to do today is we just want to dissect the prominence of the state to see why the state was so powerful and influential. And also, we want to look at the contradictions that basically developed uh, in terms of the weaknesses that occurred when the state was performing its functions in the economy. Why were there weaknesses? And you will see that some of the weaknesses basically arise from the size of the state itself. Like, for example, when you have a large state that happens to pretty much employ a large number of people in the civil servants and everywhere else, um, monopolizes all the resources of the country. Everything belongs to the state, all resources, controls large investment budgets. It's only the state that can actually invest in huge projects. The private sector, of course, is nowhere to be found when it comes to huge projects. So the state usually is the one that undertakes those projects. It does control the whole financial sector in terms of banking and everything else. Nowadays, of course, you see that the banking system, there has been a lot of structural changes in the financial sector, whereby you see a lot of small private banks springing up, whereas before the whole financial sector was pretty much owned and controlled by the state. So you don't find any private banks, but nowadays, of course, things have changed, and you see the development of private banks in a lot of the MENA region countries, which is extremely important, as we will see later on. Um, they obviously, in other words, they also own all parts and aspects of communication. So there are basically no private companies like you will see in other developing countries or industrialized countries, whereby you see the private sector is pretty much involved in communication. In the MENA region, communication is basically owned and controlled by by the state. Even though, as I said, there are some changes, but very minimal. And most of these changes in communication really comes in terms of radio stations, TV stations that some are obviously privately controlled, but the majority are still controlled by the state. When it comes to cell phones and all those top communications, internet and what have you, that is still owned by the state. So the private sector really does not play any role in that part of communications or in that aspect of communication that deals with cell phones and internet and what have you. Transportation, again, it's solely owned by the state. Again, very few exceptions here and there. Not that much to really be of importance that happens to be under the private sector, but the majority, the bulk of transportation is still under the state. Energy, power, and ports. All of these things are, again, owned by the state. So you see, the state is pretty much influential. The state is pretty much found everywhere in all aspects of life. So as a result, they do have huge influence on what goes on, and um, in other words, the state reigns supreme. Basically, that's how I would summarize the MENA region, especially before 1985. As I said, after 1985, you had some changes. The changes were not that huge, but I mean, it's better than nothing. I mean, at least it's a step forward, towards privatizing certain things. Now, obviously, I am not in favor of privatizing everything. there are certain things that you really can't privatize, that I believe that the government, uh, or if you will, not the government, but if you want to privatize it, you want to do it in such a way as to have some level of government control. Otherwise, it becomes a complete sham. Like, for example, communications and energy, if they are completely privatized, then those can turn into monopolies, and they can actually exploit the consumer to a huge extent. So you don't want to do that. In other words, you want to have what we call natural monopolies, like in industrialized countries, like in the U.S., for example. We know that power is pretty much privatized in the U.S. In other words, the provision of electricity and so on, that the state has nothing to do with that. It's pretty much privatized. It's a monopoly. In other words, you look at Southern California here, especially in Orange County. The only company that really provides the electric service is the Edison. So it acts basically as a monopoly. However, there is some control imposed on Edison. In other words, they are not allowed to actually exploit the consumer to the extent of actually being a regular monopoly. In other words, there are certain guidelines that the Edison company and other companies in transportation, communication, and other companies in transportation as well, that come under the control of the government. So there are certain guidelines, there are certain rules, even though they're private companies, but they have to adhere to certain rules and regulations, and that's the way it should be. Otherwise, a lot of these companies can become monopolies overnight, and they can charge exorbitant prices, and the consumer obviously is at their mercy, because you need the service, and if that's the only company that is providing the service, you really have no choice but to pay whatever the company dictates. So again, as I said, you have to be very careful. Yeah, privatization is good, it's efficient, but at the same time, if it is not well controlled, it can actually lead to exploitation more than anything else. So again, a lot of these things are pretty much owned by the state in the MENA region. So from all of this that I've just said, you can see how large the state has become in the 1980s, and how influential, especially with the use of the ISI strategy that we talked about, import substitution industrialization strategy that a lot of these states embarked on, that even made the influence of the state more. In other words, it actually increased their dominance in the economy, for the simple reason because they were the only ones that were able to invest heavily in a lot of the social and other economic projects, which obviously made them more influential and more prominent. So those are some of the things that we want to look at. And today also what we want to do is we want to look at the Ataturk model in a little bit more details, because you will see that a lot of the countries in the MENA region replicated this model simply because it was so successful in Turkey during the 1920s and 30s and 40s, that a lot of the Arab countries in the MENA region felt that they could replicate that model, and that model would probably be their savior. In other words, taking them from being completely undeveloped to a more developed and industrialized country. However, obviously it did not work, and we will explain the reasons why it didn't work in the Arab countries. However, it was extremely successful in Turkey, and Turkey was able to do extremely well as a result of the Ataturk model. So, those are some of the things that we want to look at. And we will probably pick a few countries like Egypt, maybe, just to see how Egypt used the Ataturk model, and how did it actually help the Egyptian economy move forward, or it didn't, or it wasn't as successful. So we will look at that and explain the reasons why it didn't do as well in Egypt as it did in Turkey. But the Ataturk model is very important, and we really need to shed some light on it and see how it was actually replicated in some of the MENA region countries. Now, I talked about the economic contradictions that resulted basically from all of these strategies that were used by the states in the MENA region. The economic contradictions associated with the ISI strategy. I'm sure that most of you by now should know some of those contradictions, but we will go through them one by one in just a few minutes. But going back to the size of the state in the MENA region and why it actually worked as an obstacle rather than as an inducement, if you will, to growth, prosperity, etc. One of the reasons, of course, is that the state, being so large, created what we call a huge bureaucracy. And usually under a huge bureaucracy, you have what we call red tape. In other words, it's very difficult to actually carry out certain policies or certain activities very smoothly, quickly, and efficiently, simply because of the red tape that's involved in a large bureaucratic structure as the government becomes big and large. So obviously this huge bureaucracy actually was an obstacle in the development process for a lot of the countries in the MENA region. And again, this red tape and this bureaucracy usually lead to what we call administrative paralysis. In other words, most of the institutions that happen to be governed by these bureaucracies find it very difficult to make decisions. So they really have to wait, or they have to actually get the approval from various levels of administration, if you will, in order to be able to get something done. So it's time consuming. It takes time to actually implement anything, simply because, as I said, it has to go through the hierarchy of the decision-making process. And as a result, you always get what we call administrative paralysis. So that's one huge problem there. Also, we have to remember that there were certain political forces in place after the 1982-83, when these countries were ready to undertake certain structural reforms, in other words, make changes so as to make things move more smoothly. You had a lot of resistance to structural reforms, economic reforms, and all of this was basically political, which obviously gave an excuse for leaders in the MENA region to postpone structural reforms all the way up until the late 80s, early 90s. That's when actually structural reforms began. But these countries were simply advised by the global institutions to embark on the structural reforms way, way before 1985, 1986. But obviously, as I said, they simply started a little bit late, and as a result, a lot of these countries had to pay the price for that. Now, the goal of any state, of course, whether the state is large or small, it really doesn't matter. But the goal of any state is really, here, of course, we're talking about the MENA region in particular, or specifically. The goal of the state or the goal of the leadership in those states is to basically reduce poverty as much as possible, eradicate illiteracy, build a diversified and a prosperous economy, and establish what we call national sovereignty, especially for those countries that are fresh from becoming free or getting their freedom from their colonizers. They felt that national sovereignty looms large for them and for the population for that matter. So establishing national sovereignty was also one huge goal for these countries. So in a nutshell, these countries were pretty much, or these states were pretty much interested in overcoming backwardness. And I guess, the book talks about the main traits of backwardness. In other words, well, what is meant by backwardness, or how do we define backwardness, or how do we know if a country is backward or not? And I guess, there are many definitions that we can actually use to define what backwardness is, and what are the tools available for states to use or utilize in order to overcome this notion of backwardness. But we're going to stick to the ideas that your book obviously talks about. And your book basically defines backwardness in terms of, if you remember, we talked about the agricultural trap. Does everyone remember that?
Yes.
I remember the double deficit with the agriculture.
Yeah, but do you remember when we talked about the poverty trap?
I remember the agricultural trap being that these countries wanted to industrialize quickly and then forgot about the agriculture. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah. In other words, when we talk about the poverty trap, and we tend to allude that to the farming sector or to the agricultural sector in terms of countries in less developed countries, and particularly in some of the MENA region countries who are not oil rich, happen to basically rely on the agricultural sector to actually develop their economies, to produce and export primary products and agricultural goods. Now, the reason why we call this the poverty trap is simply because this is something that's imposed on these countries. In other words, they are pretty much given no choice, but they are told, hey, you have a competitive advantage in producing agricultural goods, And as a result, you don't have a competitive advantage in anything else. You don't have it in manufacturing. So, why start thinking about an industrial base when you don't have a competitive advantage in it? Because after all, you're not going to be able to compete with the rest of the world. And as a result, you will just be wasting your scarce resources away. So the best thing for you is to basically rely on producing agricultural goods. Now, producing agricultural goods, of course, it's something that will continue to leave these countries in poverty. And the reason is very simple, because the demand and supply for agricultural products is highly inelastic. So when the demand and supply for these products is highly inelastic, it's going to lead to potential or huge level of fluctuations in the prices of these goods. So your export markets are not going to be very stable. They will be highly unstable simply because of the inelastic demand and elastic supply of these goods. And this will affect the terms of trade for these countries. In other words, the prices of these goods would be so low simply because they are determined, prices are determined in highly competitive markets. Most agricultural products are determined in markets that are highly competitive. Now, given the competitive market and given the inelasticity of demand and supply, any demand or supply shock will lead these prices to fall tremendously. And when the prices of these goods, which is the income to these countries basically, falls, their income would fall as well. And their terms of trade will be worsened because these countries will be importing manufactured goods. Most manufactured goods are not produced in perfectly competitive markets, but they're pretty much markets that are defined by oligopolistic and monopolistic market structures. So their prices usually are extremely high. So now when you have to import these goods, you have to pay a very high price, and your exports are going to be pretty much getting very low prices. So this will change the terms of trade not in your favor. In other words, your terms of trade will deteriorate. And this would mean that you have to sell so much of your goods in order to be able to import a very small quantity of goods that are produced outside. So, and that's the reason why we say that those countries that happen to rely on producing agricultural products will ultimately suffer, and the doors for improving their lots will be soon closed. In other words, they will not have an opportunity to actually have higher incomes, and as a result will be mirrored in poverty for the rest of their lives, unless of course they make structural changes, as some countries have done, and they were very successful, such as China and the Southeast Asian countries. They pretty much left the agricultural products altogether, and they started reforming their economy and focusing more on labor-intensive manufactured goods, because that's basically the niche that they found. They knew that they could not compete with the rest of the world in producing capital-intensive goods or high-tech goods. So they decided to go with the labor intensive manufacturing goods. And that's basically where they got a niche, they got an advantage, and were able to trade it with the rest of the world, and were able to actually open doors in terms of economic prosperity, etc. The MENA region, of course, did not do that. The MENA region, those who were actually producing oil, kept on producing oil and selling oil without diversifying their economy. And those, of course, who did not have oil, they continued to focus on agriculture. That was a huge mistake, of course, for a lot of the countries in the MENA region. Now, even oil, if you look at oil, oil also has highly inelastic demand and highly inelastic supply. So any shock on either side, the demand or supply in the oil market, will lead to a huge fall in the price of oil. And that's exactly what happened. During the world recession, the price of oil pretty much tanked. Or
Did you see what happened
during, yeah,
within the last year when the price of oil went like negative $30 a barrel or something?
exactly, right. Yeah, but well, that's basically only here in the US, of course, that went negative. Usually, you don't have negative prices, but the reason why it went negative, this was basically not on physical markets. It was simply negative on uh, uh, the financial aspect of dealing with markets. In other words, on paper, basically, it went negative. But in the market itself, of course, when we're looking at the buying and selling of oil in world markets, it didn't go negative, but it went negative here in the US in the stock market, I guess, for oil, whereby, again, I really don't want to get into that. That would take us some time to actually explain what went wrong with the oil market in the US, particularly in Texas, and why it went negative, for the simple reason because um, companies were producing more oil than they can handle, than there was demand for. So there was a huge surplus of oil. And now those people who actually bought oil in the stock market, now they actually had to get physical delivery of it. And that was the crunch of it. So now where are you going to put the oil? Now you have bought, let's say, I don't know, 5,000 stocks in the stock market, um, equivalent, let's say, to maybe, I don't know, 100 barrels of oil or 50 barrels or 1,000 barrels. I don't know. But now, when you were asked to take physical delivery of it, what are you going to do? Where are you going to store it? There weren't enough warehouses to store that oil. So what investors did is that they were willing to pay people to actually take physical delivery of that oil. And that's why the price of oil went negative. In other words, I was willing to pay you to actually, try to get rid of that oil, put it somewhere, warehouse it somewhere, or, you take care of it. I'm willing to pay you for that.
Okay, that makes more sense. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's basically what happened. But in the real world, of course, when we're looking at the world oil markets, there's plenty of warehouses in the MENA region and in other oil producing countries that, the price of oil basically did not go negative. But it only went negative in that particular area for those investors that obviously were not in the oil business to begin with. They were simply investors, and they had no idea what even oil looks like. And now, they're all of a sudden asked to take physical delivery of it. So what do you do? You're obviously willing to pay people to actually take charge or take ownership of those barrels of oil that you invested in. And that's basically the reason why it went negative. Anyway, so going back to the MENA region, in as far as oil is concerned, again, here, you have to remember that oil prices tumbled during the 2013, 14, I guess, 17, somewhere around there, where it went actually down to about $30. Now it went up again to maybe about 40 or 42. I don't remember what the price of oil is today, but it's somewhere around there in the mid 40s maybe, or low 40s. But remember, the price of oil reached as high as $140 per barrel. In the 70s, it was, selling for about $3 a barrel. That was in the early 70s. But then, of course, after the Arab oil embargo on the US and Western Europe in 1973, oil prices shot up 300%. This simply shows you the volatility of the price of oil because it's highly inelastic. So prices are extremely volatile. They can go up 300% and they can come down 500%. That's how volatile the price of oil is. And that's why it's extremely important for oil producing countries to pay extreme attention to this price volatility. And that's why they have to pretty much diversify their economies and not depend on oil because of this volatility problem. But anyway.
Professor?
Yes.
You think, like, as a lot of countries, like I know China and the US have talked about being more eco-friendly and development of electric cars. Is this also going to be a huge aspect for the MENA region in terms of oil? Because potentially it's going to be eventually not needed for like daily transportation and things like that.
Absolutely. This is another problem that the oil-producing countries are going to face. The demand for oil is going to fall. No question about it. Because of the, the creation of the OPEC cartel. This is really where the whole problem started. Now, a lot of countries in the who were actually members of OPEC felt, hey, it's a great idea, to form a cartel and to make all these huge profits during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But you know what that did? It simply invited a lot of competition. It simply invited a lot of potential investors. So you had countries who had nothing to do with oil now starting to enter the oil business, producing oil. Like Britain, for example, the UK, exploring and finding oil in the North Sea. Then you had Finland doing exactly the same thing, Holland. And that's basically where the Dutch disease came from. So when Holland actually became an oil producer, they found out exactly what the Dutch disease is. As a result of producing oil and getting all those oil revenues, which we will talk about, I guess, in chapter 9. We will talk a little bit more about the Dutch disease. But you can see a lot of countries have entered the oil market, supplying more oil. And not only that, the US increased its production of oil through fossil oil. All of this happened simply because the price of oil shot up to the roof. It reached $140, $150, $160 a barrel when it only cost about $3 a barrel to produce. So just think about the profits made. When you produce something that costs you $3 and you sell it for $150 and you sell millions, not a year, a day, millions of barrels a day. So you can visualize or fathom exactly the amount of profits that these countries were actually making. And when you make this type of profits, obviously you're going to invite a lot of competition. And you're going to invite a lot of companies that will try and introduce new substitutes to oil. All of this happened, by the way, and it started to chip away at the power of OPEC. And I don't know if OPEC will continue to survive or not in the coming few years. I doubt that very much, but who knows? I mean, OPEC has always proven me wrong because I thought that OPEC will pretty much disintegrate 10 years ago, but in fact they didn't. However, they're having problems right now. So there's a lot of infighting between the OPEC members themselves, and they have not reached any sort of agreement in as far as the setting up of quotas. Simply because these countries have different cost structures, different demand structures. So it's extremely difficult to set up quotas. And then, of course, you have a lot of infighting, political infighting between many countries in the OPEC. You have Saudi Arabia, you have Iran, you have Qatar, you have the United Arab Emirates. And all of these countries are pretty much, they don't see eye to eye with one another. So there is a lot of infighting. And then, you have a lot of countries that refuse to be members of OPEC, and they are oil producing countries such as Russia, for example, Indonesia, the US. The US is a huge producer of oil, but they are not members of OPEC. So you have a lot of countries who happen to be on the outside, and they can be extremely influential in breaking down the influence that OPEC has in the world oil markets. So again, we will see what would happen to OPEC, but I think they're simply having problems right now. They're trying, of course, to attract other oil producing countries to become part of the OPEC cartel, but a lot of these countries refused. They just wanted to have their own independence, and they wanted to make their own decisions in terms of how much to produce, how much to sell. So they don't want to be restricted by OPEC and the rules and regulations set up by OPEC to actually discipline its members. Again, I don't want to go into that. That would take us off track here. But these are just some important points to note in as far as the MENA region and its reliance and dependence on oil. It's not a very good idea. But again, I'm not going to say here that the states or the decision makers in the MENA region have not thought about this, and they have not tried to pretty much diversify their economies. I think they have, but they have not been as successful as one would have thought. And basically, we will look at some of the reasons why diversification did not work for these countries in the MENA region later on. So hopefully by now we know, again, going back to the state, how large the state is, and some of the weaknesses that a large state would bring to the table. The economic contradictions and the political resistance, of course, to structural reform has a lot to do, of course, with the weakness of the MENA region's economies, which we will talk about also very, very shortly today if we have time. Now, the functions of the state in the MENA region have also, by the way, grown exponentially after these states realized or got their independence. Um, um, so, you know, a lot of the services and a lot of the goods that are produced in the MENA region, a lot of the services that are provided in the MENA region are simply provided by the government. Again, as I said, because the private sector is so small, so weak, inept, that it wasn't really given that much opportunity to actually take an active role in the uh, economic and financial working of those countries. In fact, I think they should have been given more opportunities. They should have given more incentives, but you know, it is what it is, and that's what the private sector looks like today in the MENA region. Even though some strides and progress has been made in as far as giving some incentives to the private sector to actually grow and prosper, and um, and there has been some success. I mean, in other words, you know, we cannot ignore that the private sector has, in fact, made some inroads in some of the MENA region countries. So it's not all bleak, in other words. There is some light at the end of the tunnel, if you want to look at it that way. Um, Now, reforms, of course, that started in the 1990s began actually to chip away at the dominance of the state and the public sector. Um, and as you can see that in the MENA region, the state pretty much gained legitimacy uh, basically um, in other words, the reason why states have legitimacy in the MENA region comes from the status quo. In other words, um, there isn't really um, uh, that much demand um, on a large scale here. I'm talking about large scale demand for any change. So, you know, in the MENA region, pretty much everyone is laying back and, you know, accepting the status quo. Now, if you try, obviously, to change the status quo, then, um, you know, that will probably lead to civil wars. It would lead to governments retaliating, and yeah, it's going to lead to a lot of chaos. So, you know, a lot of these states in the MENA region have pretty much gained their authority or their legitimacy from the status quo that we see in the MENA region. Um, Now, the state leaders, of course, the state and the leaders of the state, they pretty much feel that they have a right and an obligation to set a course for society. And obviously, the right and obligation that they have is to simply eradicate backwardness. This is basically, you know, the goal that they have in mind. And as a result, they feel that they do have the, I would say, the right to use uh, public resources or to utilize public resources or whatever the country owns in terms of resources. They feel that, you know, they have a right to use them in order to achieve that goal, the goal of eradicating backwardness. Now, of course, many times these resources are really not used in an efficient manner. Most of these resources are basically diverted towards corruption, And that's basically, you know, what happens in a lot of these countries. Um, uh, you know, either, you know, these resources are diverted towards corruption or, you know, towards patronage, basically, like what happens in the GCC countries or the resource-rich labor-poor countries. You know, a lot of these resources are diverted towards patronage, keeping citizens happy and not giving them an incentive to actually um, try to depose governments or get involved in um, revolutionary fervors, if you will. So that, you know, those are the type of things that the countries, some of the countries in the MENA region, particularly the GCC countries, have used those resources to keep their citizens happy and to prevent them from, you know, demonstrations, social unrest, etc. Now, the Ataturk
Okay.
model, going back to the Ataturk model, this is our foundation. This is the basis, basically, where we're going to start from. And the Ataturk model, obviously, is a model that was introduced by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who was actually he was the founder of modern Turkey, if you will, or the Republic of Turkey. In 1923, that's when Turkey, modern Turkey, or the Republic of Turkey was formed in 1923, because before that there was no such thing as Turkey. It was simply the Ottoman Empire. That's how Turkey was known as, the Ottoman Empire, and it stretched across so many countries, basically, in Eastern Europe, North Africa, the Middle East. All of that was part of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire was a huge empire, was very much equivalent to the Roman, the Greek, and the Persian empires, if not more prominent, because the Ottoman Empire was extremely strong and had a huge army. It had a lot of resources by conquering a lot of these countries and putting their hands on the resources of those countries. So the Ottoman Empire was a very, very strong empire. And as I said before, it was able to occupy and conquer a lot of countries in Eastern Europe, as well as in Africa and the Middle East as well. Now, Mustafa Ataturk was obviously, he was a soldier, if you will, a junior officer in the Ottoman Empire army, and he fought a lot of the wars that the Ottoman Empire pretty much waged in many countries. He was positioned in Libya, by the way. Kemal Ataturk. There are streets named after him in Libya. Now, remember, Turkey occupied Libya for about 400 years. So there is a lot of links or connections, if you will, social, cultural, historical, political, economic, between Turkey and Libya. So it's very, very difficult to separate Libya from Turkey. In other words, you know, most of the words used in Libyan vocabulary are Turkish words, basically. A lot of the cultural norms are borrowed from Turkey as well, especially, you know, when it comes to weddings and other feasts. They're pretty much replicated over the Turkish weddings and you know, other customs, Turkish customs. So, you know, I mean, you know, when a country stays 400 years, it's bound to leave its footprints in that particular country. And obviously, you can see that Turkey was able to do that, not only in Libya, but in a lot of other countries where it stayed for such a long period of time. So again, going back to the Ataturk model, was obviously this model was introduced by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who is the founder of modern Turkey, and he was the one actually who signed the Lausanne Treaty in 1923 with both Britain and France. Those were the main co-signer of the treaty with Turkey, which meant that Turkey would give up a lot of the countries that it had under its control to both France and Britain, and Turkey will be able to keep some parts to itself, and that will obviously form the geography of modern Turkey as we know it today. Ataturk, of course, was an inspiring leader. He built a secular, republican, nationalist system in Anatolia. Now, Anatolia, of course, is those of you who are familiar with the Turkish geography, part of Turkey is in Asia and part of it is in Europe. So the the Asian part is simply referred to as Anatolia or Asia Minor. Sometimes we pretty much refer to it as Asia Minor, which is pretty much located in Western Asia. So that's where Ataturk pretty much founded his new modern republic. He founded in Anatolia. Now, he obviously made reforms, and a lot of reforms, when he established this new country called Turkey. One of the things that he did was he abolished the caliphate, because remember, Turkey was known as the Ottoman Empire, and it ruled by caliphate's rules, basically, which is simply more. It comes under the auspices of the Islamic religion. Khilafa in Arabic means succession, basically. So the caliphate rule is the rule that comes as a result of succession. In other words, the rule moves from, at least in Turkey, from the king to his son, from his son to his grandson, etc., etc. So this is what we call the khilafa, the succession of who will obviously take power. And obviously when Ataturk formed his new modern republic, he abolished the caliphate. So you really don't have kings, and you don't have sons of kings ruling after, and you don't have grandsons, and that's all abolished. And he also pretty much introduced the Latin alphabet, because the Ottoman Empire used the Arabic alphabet. Now, Ataturk felt that the Arabic alphabet was not conducive to modernization. I don't know what he was thinking about. I mean, you can't blame an alphabet for modernization or non-modernization. So again, at least this is what he felt. He felt that the Arabic alphabet was not conducive to modernization, and as a result, he replaced it with the Latin alphabet. So now Turkey pretty much writes in the same way as the Latin alphabet is. In other words, English, German, French, Italian, that's all Latin alphabet. And so, he wanted to assimilate his country's language, if you will, or the way they write, with that of Western Europe, basically. So he abolished again the Arabic alphabet and he replaced it with the Latin alphabet. He also built a credible military structure, and he diversified the industrial sector of the economy. And he did that, of course, through the ISI, import substitution industrialization. And he rapidly expanded the educational system. And he liberated the economy from dependence on the West. And he also fostered the growth of an indigenous capitalist class through the establishment of the very well-known, famous IC business bank. So if you go to Turkey, you will see these two letters IC, you know it refers to business banks, basically, and this is something that he pretty much fostered and promoted to actually finance the private enterprise. This was the reason why these banks were established. They were simply established for the sole purpose of financing private enterprise. And obviously he did an excellent job of that. He was able to strengthen the private sector in Turkey. And the private sector pretty much filled in a lot of gaps that the state had. So in 1934, Turkey pretty much embarked on its first 5-year plan, which was the blueprint for the ISI, basically, import substitution industrialization. It started first with developing the textile industry, utilizing Turkish cotton and selling it to a large domestic market. In other words, he really wanted to build a market within Turkey, a domestic market, a large market, rather than simply focus on outside markets. He felt that this was the next step. But the first thing that he needed to do was to really develop and enlarge the domestic market and make sure that the market is large enough to actually help the domestic industries that he was building. So that was a smart move on his part. And he also focused on other industries such as food processing, sugar refining, and simple assemblies. And this was simply known as the easy phase of the ISI. So you see what Ataturk did, he divided the ISI into several phases. The first phase, he called it the easy phase. The second phase, the medium. The third phase, the hardest phase. And he was, taking the country in steps in as far as the ISI strategy was concerned. So he wasn't really trying to do everything in one shot, like a lot of the Arab countries tried to do, which basically explains the reason why they failed. But he was obviously taking this ISI in phases. And eventually, he started to enter the second phase of launching projects in basic chemicals, cement, iron, and paper. That was the second phase. Now, the second 5-year plan. So we had the first 5-year plan started in 1934, and the second 5-year plan started in 1938. So the second 5-year plan was adopted in 1938, and in this second 5-year plan, over 100 enterprises were planned with industrial deepening, with basic chemicals, engineering, and marine transport. And this was known as the Big Push Strategy. So 100 enterprises were pretty much developed and were given the green light, basically, to lead the second phase of the ISI strategy. And again, they did an excellent job in that too. And after the Second World War, a major shift in the political domain occurred in Turkey, of course. After the Second World War, we had a transformation from a single party system to a multi-party system. Because remember, Ataturk believed in one or a single party system. But after the Second World War, there was a major shift in the political domain, as I said, in Turkey. And this led the single party now to evolve into several or multi-party system, with the Democratic Party, of course, winning elections and changing the political landscape. In other words, remember, the Ataturk party was the nationalist party. Now, the Nationalist Party obviously lost the elections after the Second World War, and the Democratic Party won the elections, and as a result, they changed the political landscape, i.e., they changed gears from etatism. Now, etatism, remember what etatism means. It simply means that the state is supreme, that the state is basically involved in all aspects of life, economic, social, political. That's what etatism means. So when the Democrats won elections in Turkey, they changed gears from etatism to liberal economic policies to actually benefit the commercial farmers and also to benefit the industrial bourgeoisie, basically. That's what the Democratic Party did in Turkey. In fact, it invested so much money in trying to make all these liberal reforms and in transforming the Turkish economy from etatism to liberalism, and put a lot of faith in the private sector to actually allow the private sector to take the leading role in any economic development and for the state to actually take the back seat. So that was basically the whole notion of the Democratic Party in Turkey that came to power after the Second World War, and I think in the late 40s, early 50s. And that's basically, so, I mean, the Turkish experience was a successful experience. It all started with Ataturk, as I said, and then it evolved, and it became more of a liberal economy with the private sector taking hold and becoming stronger. And as I said, they were pretty much successful in doing what they have to do. Now, Egypt, in fact, pretty much followed in the footsteps of the Ataturk model, especially with President Nasser, who came to power in 1956 in Egypt. And if you remember what we said about Nasser's ideology, of course, was pretty much a nationalist ideology. He believed in the Arab Union. He believed in the Arab cause. He believed that they were given the short end of the stick, if you will, through this colonization process, and he felt that the Arabs were never in charge of their own fate. They were simply were tossed around from one colonial power to another, from the Turks to the French to the British to the Italian. And, he felt that it's about time that the Arabs have their own true independence, and, they will stand on their own feet without having to be colonized or ruled by any other nation. So he was pretty much for national sovereignty. So President Nasser of Egypt was a nationalist, and he was obviously very much opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood, because he felt that the Muslim Brotherhood had an agenda which was very much different from the Arab national agenda. And for that matter, he fought them very hard, and he imprisoned a lot of their political leaders, and he banned the Muslim Brotherhood as a political party, was completely banned. And as I said, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt at the time was Sayyid Qutb, and we will talk about that hopefully in chapter 13 or chapter 12, I believe, when we come to look at Islam, if Islam is the solution or not. So we will talk about the Muslim Brotherhood there. But at least this was Nasser's idea and philosophy, that he wanted to actually establish an independent Arab nationalist state. And he actually believed in Arab unity. So he believed that all the Arabs should unite under one country. In other words, there are 18 Arab countries. He felt that they should all unite, and he tried to unite them, but obviously he failed. He was able to unite Egypt with Syria, and that was called the United Arab Republic. But then, of course, it did not succeed. So Syria pretty much withdrew from that union. He also tried to unite with Libya, with Iraq, with Yemen. So, in other words, he worked extremely hard to see if he could unite the Arab countries together under one republic called the United Arab Republic. But as I said, his dreams did not come true, and he died in 1970 when the Arabs were in turmoil. And, there are a lot of things that did not go his way, especially the 1967 war with Israel, when President Nasser was completely devastated, together with his army, in one sweep blow by Israel, which obviously put a lot of pressure on President Nasser to resign. And he, in fact, gave his resignation as a result of his defeat in the 67 war. But his popularity was so huge in the Arab world and in Egypt itself that the people actually did not want him to resign. They wanted him to continue. And in fact, he did. But also, President Nasser was a socialist in thinking. So he formed the one political party in Egypt. This is a single political party, again, replicating the Ataturk model. And he called that party the ASU, the Arab Socialist Union Party. And that party obviously was pretty much in charge of everything in Egypt. All aspects, all tenets of life in Egypt was dominated by this ASU party. He, in fact, started with economic plans just very, very similar to the Ataturk economic plan. So he had his first 5-year plan, and then he had his second 5-year plan, just like what Ataturk was doing in Turkey. And, to some extent, his economic plans were successful because they pretty much led to economic prosperity in Egypt. In other words, if I visited Egypt when I was a kid, very, very young. I mean, but still, and I visited again, and that was during the Nasser's era. And I visited again after Nasser's era during Mubarak. I could see a huge difference. In other words, under Nasser's era, Egypt was a lot cleaner, a lot safer. You could buy things very, very cheaply in many, many markets. Everything was available. A lot of factories, but under Mubarak, I think a lot of that pretty much went to waste. In other words, Mubarak changed the whole economic structure of Egypt from trying to rely on itself and depend on its resources, whether it is labor, capital, or what have you, and instead Mubarak followed in the footsteps of President Sadat, which is really to liberalize the economy, to focus more on trade, and obviously that did not work as well in Egypt, as we will see. But remember when we talked about President Nasser, we said that he pretty much started the first 5-year economic plan with building the Aswan Dam, which was extremely important for Egypt. I guess we're going over time here, so I'm just going to stop it right here and hopefully continue next time. Are there any questions so far?
Will there be a similar study guide as chapters 1 through 4 posted for chapters 5 and 6? Or if this is still chapter 5?
Oh, you mean the notes?
Yes. I've read through the book and gotten some stuff out on my own, but I was curious about what you would be able to get out of it.
Yes, I will. I will. And as I said before, I will do that. It's just going to take me some time, so just be patient with me. But I will put them for you, hopefully this weekend. I was actually supposed to have them, worked out this weekend, but for some reason I got busy, and then we had this fire, I guess, which really threw us out of balance. And again, so just be patient, and I will put those notes together for you.
All right, that's it from me.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes,
Thanks,
thank
Professor.
you. Okay. Good. So for those of you who don't know what we're doing now, we're obviously covering chapter 7. So we finished chapter 5. We skipped 6, of course, as we said last time. And now we are on chapter 7. So you really need to do some readings on chapter 7 and follow up with what we're doing here, because that's exactly what we're doing right now, covering chapter 7. Okay, so thank you all, and have a wonderful weekend, and hopefully we will see you on Tuesday.
Thanks, Professor. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.